Hello and welcome to Flipped GCSE Biology, Unit B9 Inheritance, Lesson 2, Monohybrid Inheritance. Before we start, let's just recap a little bit this topic. So, you might want to pause the video here, see what you can remember from last lesson. So, in sexual reproduction, the offspring inherit characteristics from both parents, as opposed to asexual, where it's just one parent, remember. These characteristics come from the chromosomes of the gametes. When gametes are produced, they will only contain one chromosome of each pair. In fertilization, the zygote receives one chromosome of each pair from the sperm and one from each pair from the egg. The chromosomes in a pair may have different forms of the gene. These different forms are called alleles. So before we get started, you need to know a couple of important definitions. The physical appearance of an organism is described as its phenotype. For example, brown eyes, yellow flowers, black hair. These characteristics are determined by the organism's genotype, the genes that it has. There can be a few different phenotypes for each characteristic. For example, flower colour. The phenotypes or alleles could be purple, pink, or white. Forms of a gene then. Genes, as you know, control a characteristic, for example, hair colour. There are two forms of a gene which can be called alleles, for example, brown or blonde. So remember, chromosomes are found in pair. You get one from your mother and one from your father, the maternal and the paternal chromosomes. Genes are found at locations on the chromosome. For example, here we're looking at a gene for hair colour. You notice here that two copies that come from the parents are the same. They're both capital B forms. These are dominant alleles. Dominant alleles will mask the other allele and are always shown in the person's phenotype. The person's genotype could be capital B, and they'd show the capital B characteristic. Or it could be capital B, small b, and they would still show the same characteristic, even though their genotype was different. Recessive alleles only show in the phenotype if both the alleles are recessive. For example, small b, and they are shown by a lowercase letter. Genotypes then. If someone has the genotype capital B, we can say they are homozygous or true breeding for that characteristic. If the genotype is small b, we would also say they are homozygous or true breeding. Homo in biology, or Latin I think it is, means the same. Zygous, as you can see, relates to zygote. If someone has two different copies of a gene, for example, capital B, small b, they are heterozygous. Hetero means different. So let's look at the inheritance of gender as a first example here. So if you have a male and female parent, that's their phenotype. The phenotype would be male or female. The genotype of a male, if you remember, is XY, and the genotype of a female is XX. Now, when sperm is being produced inside the male's testes, they will either have the X chromosome or the Y chromosome. When eggs are being produced in the female's ovaries, they will always have the X chromosome. Now, this type of diagram is called genetic cross, and what it does is it shows what happens if each different sperm were to fertilize each different egg, and it will allow you to find out the proportions of the phenotypes of the offspring. So if we imagine that a male sperm with the X chromosome could fertilize a female egg with the X chromosome, either one of them, or a male sperm with a Y chromosome will fertilize a female egg with an X chromosome. So here we can predict the possible genotypes of the offspring. If the X sperm fertilizes the X egg, it will produce offspring with two X's. If the Y sperm fertilizes the X egg, then it will produce offspring with a genotype XY. The phenotypes of the offspring, or the first generation, are female, male, and male. In genetics type questions, you might be asked to do the phenotype ratio. In this situation, we've got the ratio of 2 to 2, female to male. Or we can simplify this down to 1 to 1. The genotype ratio, XX to XY, is 2 to 2, which can also be simplified to 1 to 1. Now let's go to a more difficult example. We're looking at brown-eyed and blue-eyed people. Okay, so a homozygous dominant brown-eyed person and a homozygous recessive blue-eyed person. If we imagine that they're going to have children, then you use this type of genetic cross to find out the probability of them having children with blue eyes or brown eyes. So before you start a question like this, you should always say what each letter represents. Now, we always use the capital letter for the dominant characteristic and a lowercase for the recessive, and you have to always use the same letter. So, for example, capital B equals brown and small b equals blue. You can pause the video here and try and think what the parents' phenotype and genotypes are. So, the phenotype of the parents would be brown eyes crossed with brown eyes. The genotype would be capital B, that's the homozygous dominant, and little b, that's homozygous recessive. The gametes produced by the brown-eyed parent would be capital B or capital B. The gametes produced by the blue-eyed parent would be little b or little b. If we do the crosses now and imagine with the capital B sperm fertilizes the capital B egg, or the other way around, it will give you the possible first generation genotypes, F1 generation genotypes of capital B small b, capital B small b, capital small b, and capital B small b. You will always write the capital letter first in situations like this. And it also will go in alphabetical order, as you might have noticed with the XY for the male before. So, the phenotypes are brown eyes, brown eyes, brown eyes, brown eyes. And the ratio is obviously 1, the phenotype ratio, and the genotype ratio is also 1. So you notice that in this situation here, these people, if they were to have babies, all of the babies, 100% of them would have brown eyes. So now, we can do what's called an F1 cross. Now, in humans, this is something that wouldn't necessarily happen, but it can be used a lot to talk about plants. This F1 cross is what happens when you cross together two organisms of the first generation, the F1 generation. This is called selfing or inbreeding. So, same again. For this question, you would need to state what each letter represents. Capital B is brown, small b is blue. Remember, we are crossing together two individuals from the first generation. So they both have brown eyes. So brown eyes crossed with brown eyes. The parent's genotype, if you remember, is capital B small b, capital B small b. Now this is where it starts getting a bit more complicated here. So, the sperms that could be produced could contain capital B or small b, and the eggs could also contain capital B or small b. Now there's a different way of doing these genetic crosses that you might prefer, and this is called a Punnett square. And what we do is we put the gametes into a table like this, and then you would just read down to figure out what would happen if each sperm fertilized each egg. So we can fill it in here. You can see capital B together, capital B small b together, capital B small b together, and small b small b. So the F2 second generation genotypes are capital B, that's homozygous dominant, capital B small b, those are heterozygous, and small b, which are homozygous recessive. So the phenotypes are, have a think about their eye colour, if you can figure it out. Brown eyes, brown eyes, brown eyes, and blue eyes. Therefore, the phenotype ratio is 3 to 1. 3 brown eyes to 1 blue eye. So for every 4 children they have, in theory, one of them would have blue eyes. The genotype ratio in this situation is 1 to 2 to 1. That's homozygous dominant to heterozygous to homozygous recessive. And that is it, guys. We'll have a lot more practice of this in class.